March 10th, 1906. Courrières, France. At dawn, deep beneath the Pas-de-Calais coal basin, the ground shuddered. A single spark tore through miles of dusty tunnels, igniting coal dust and gas into a roaring firestorm. Flames chased miners through the dark. The blast tore through shafts, collapsing timbers, hurling men and wagons like toys. Above ground, smoke poured from the pit heads. Mothers ran from their homes. The air smelled of sulphur and ash. By mid-morning, the earth had gone still again, but 1,099 men and boys lay trapped below, and the question that would haunt Europe was simple. How could this have possibly happened? The warning signs. The coal basin of Kurier stretched across northern France like a living machine. A patchwork of blackened fields, smoking chimneys, and yawning pit heads that drew men underground before sunrise, and did not release them until nightfall. It was one of Europe's most productive mining regions, feeding the furnaces of Lille, Paris, and beyond. By 1906, the Compagnie des Mines de Courrier employed more than 2,000 men in a network of shafts and tunnels that ran for miles beneath the villages of Billy-Montigny, Méricourt, and Salomines. Coal was the heart of progress, and Courrières was its beating artery. The miners knew the rhythm well, or the descent, the darkness, the smell of damp rock, the crack of pickaxes, the rasp of carts being pulled by ponies that never saw the sun. Every day they worked by the light of oil lamps, their breath mixing with the dust of the earth. Each inhale a small gamble against what they couldn't see. The work paid little, but it paid enough to feed a family. Boys as young as 11 carried tools and lamps for the older men. Entire generations descended together. Fathers, sons, brothers, neighbours. Underground, age mattered less than endurance. What kept them alive was routine. When to brace a beam, when to listen for the groan of a shifting wall, when to smell for the faintest trace of gas. They all knew what fire damp meant, the invisible methane that could build up in low seams, waiting only for a spark. They called it the miner's ghost, because it gave no warning until it struck, and yet, by 1906, safety had become a casualty of profit. The Courrières company was expanding fast, hungry to meet demand. Production quotas rose, and with them the pressure to cut corners. Ventilation shafts were left half complete. Old sections of mine were reopened before proper gas tests were done. Blasting powder was stored where it shouldn't have been, close to coal dust, timber, and friction. In the months before March, the warning signs came like whispers, then shouts. On December 30th, 1905, a small explosion rattled one of the upper galleries in pit number. 2 men were injured, but the damage was quickly sealed off and forgotten. Management called it an isolated incident. The mine resumed work within a day. In January, miners began reporting a strange heat in certain tunnels, as if something smouldered deep within the coal seams themselves. Ventilation crews tried to drown it with water and smother it with clay, but the air still shimmered in places, a sign of fire burning slow and deep. A group of miners from Billy-Montigny refused to enter one shaft, calling it bad air. They were docked a day's pay for insubordination. By February, inspectors noted that the safety lamps were blackened more often than usual, a subtle clue that gas was present. Yet when the men raised their concerns, they were told to keep moving. The quota was fixed. There were contracts to fill, ships waiting in Calais, trains waiting in Paris. No one wanted to halt production in one of France's largest coal suppliers. The Courrières company had political ties, investors, and a reputation to uphold. Each delay meant losses, and losses were unacceptable in a country racing toward modern industry. The miners did what they always did. They trusted their instincts and each other. In the absence of management's caution, they formed their own. When they entered a shaft, they watched for the telltale blue flicker on a lamp that meant gas was near. When one man stopped swinging his pick, others followed. They tapped the walls, sniffed the air, and kept mental maps of danger zones. These rituals weren't official policy, they were survival. The surface towns thrived on the mine's rhythm. Every dawn, the same procession of men marched toward the pit heads, lamps swinging at their sides, faces pale in the early light. Behind them, women and children watched from doorways, the smell of coal dust clinging to everything, laundry, bread, even used church pews. The mine gave life, but everyone knew it could also take it. In early March, rumours began to spread among the miners of pit number 4 that the underground fire first seen in December had reignited. Some said they could feel warmth radiating through the rock walls. Others smelled burning wood. A few men refused to go down until it was inspected. On March 8th, company engineers descended to check. They confirmed a minor fire in one of the abandoned galleries, but insisted it was under control. Work resumed the next day. That night, the fire spread silently through the interconnected tunnels. Coal dust, stirred by years of blasting, coated every surface. It was so fine it floated like mist, unseen but deadly. The miners had grown used to it, the way it hung in the air, the way it settled on their skin. What they didn't know was how little it would take to turn that dust into a weapon. On March 9th, the Courrières company sent a team underground to seal off the burning section with bricks and clay. They worked late into the evening, hammering and plastering in the dim light of their lamps. By midnight, the engineers declared the fire isolated, but in truth the heat had seeped deeper than they realised, into seams of coal that would smoulder through the night. Outside, the miners slept uneasily. Some said the earth felt different beneath their homes, warm, restless. Horses in the stables refused to settle. Even the pithead watchman noted an odd haze over the fields. Still, no alarm was raised. At dawn, whistles blew as usual. More than 1,800 men and boys descended the shafts, carrying their lamps and hopes for another day's wages. Among them was 13-year-old Emile Piat, who followed his father down into pit number 3. There was also Joseph Froissart, a veteran miner of 20 years, who had told his wife that morning, "If the air smells wrong again, I'll come back up." They were ordinary men bound by duty, poverty and faith. Faith that the mine would hold, that the company would not send them into danger knowingly. The foremen made their rounds that morning, checking for attendance more than safety. The underground fire was no longer on their minds. The pits were busy, the machines clattering, the air thick with noise and dust. Men coughed into their sleeves, joked with one another, tried not to think about the risks they couldn't control. The company's directors, seated miles away in their offices, saw Kurier as a model of industrial efficiency. Their ledgers told a story of progress, not peril. They had no reason to suspect that within hours those same ledgers would record one of the greatest tragedies in mining history. But the signs were all there: the smell, the heat, the history of neglect. The warnings had come from the men who lived closest to danger, and each had been met with silence. It wasn't malice that killed them, not in the deliberate sense. It was the quiet arithmetic of profit and habit, a calculation that safety could wait until the next quarter, that a small fire underground wasn't worth the cost of a shutdown. The mine, as it turned out, had its own timeline. Beneath the ground, gases mixed and spread. Fumes gathered along old shafts, curling through tunnels that connected pits 2, 3 and 4 like veins in the body of a single massive beast. The air was growing restless. And while the miners joked, coughed and pushed their carts, something unseen was preparing to strike. It would start with a spark, perhaps from a safety lamp, or the friction of a wagon wheel against steel rail, or a careless blast charge meant to open a new seam. The conditions were perfect. A pocket of gas, a cloud of coal dust, and a long history of ignored warnings. When it came, it would not be a simple explosion, but a chain reaction that ripped through the earth like a storm. The men of Courrières could not have known it then, but in the stillness before the blast, they stood on the edge of Europe's worst mining disaster, one that would echo not only through France, but across an entire continent's conscience. Because progress had a price, and on that March morning it was about to come due. The disaster unfolds. It began at 6:43 a.m. The miners below were just settling into the rhythm of another day. Lamps flickering, carts rattling, the muffled hum of picks and shovels echoing through miles of galleries. In the tunnels of pits 2, 3 and 4 the air was dense and heavy, thick with the invisible dust of 1,000 strikes against coal. Far above them the sun was only just cresting over the slag heaps, painting the horizon a faint orange. Then came the sound no miner ever forgets, a deep rolling thunder that didn't belong underground. It started as a low hum, distant and confused, then swelled in an instant into a roar that ripped through the mine like the earth itself had split open. Men turned towards the sound, lamps swinging wildly in the dark. A shockwave tore through the tunnels, shattering timbers and hurling bodies against the walls. In pit number 3, the explosion hit first. Flames raced through the galleries, feeding on coal dust and gas. The air itself ignited. The blast leapt through connecting tunnels into pits 2 and 4, travelling faster than sound, faster than thought. Wooden supports became kindling. Wagons were thrown end over end. Whole sections of the mine collapsed, trapping hundreds in an instant. Men never had a chance to scream. One moment they were working, the next they were gone, swallowed by smoke, heat and silence. Above ground, the first sign came in the form of dust, a white-grey plume rising from the pit heads, followed by a sound that rattled windows miles away. Roof tiles fell from houses in Billy-Montigny. Horses bolted from stables. Mothers standing at their doorways felt the tremor through the soles of their feet. Within seconds, smoke began billowing from the mine entrances. A black column rose into the sky, thick with ash, fire, and fragments of timber. A man near the surface, thrown clear by the blast, staggered into the open air with his clothes on fire. His skin peeled away as he ran, unable to speak. Others followed, crawling, gasping, blinded by soot. Inside the tunnels, chaos had no shape, only movement. In the outer galleries, some miners were knocked unconscious by the force. Others woke in total darkness. There were lamps snuffed out, ears ringing from the pressure wave. The air was filled with screams, the sound of collapsing timber, and the hiss of fire eating oxygen. Survivors stumbled through smoke so dense it burned the eyes and throat. They shouted names of fathers, brothers, friends, but their voices vanished into the roar of flame. Some tried to find ladders or haulage lines to guide them toward fresh air, but the paths were gone. Walls had caved in, tunnels sealed, airways destroyed. The temperature rose like an oven. Men tore off their shirts to breathe through the fabric. The air itself became poison. Fumes of carbon monoxide and coal gas suffocated those still conscious. Some fell to their knees, praying in the dark. Others clawed through debris with bare hands, coughing blood into the dust. At the surface, word spread faster than the smoke. Women ran from their homes toward the pit heads, their aprons still dusted with flour, children clinging to their skirts. The managers shouted orders, unsure where to begin. The elevator cages were wrecked. Cables snapped, machinery twisted from the blast. Rescue crews gathered in confusion. The mine's engineers, black with soot, argued over which shafts were safe to enter. None were. The heat pouring from the tunnels was unbearable. Every attempt to descend met walls of smoke so thick it drove men back coughing and blinded. One of the first to reach the site was a foreman named Léon Prouveau. He had been walking toward the pit head when the blast erupted. The ground jumped beneath me, he later recalled, and then I saw the sky turn black. He and a handful of men tried to descend into pit number 4, but the cage jammed halfway. Below they could hear faint cries, distant, desperate. They tried shouting back, but the voices faded. By mid-morning, the full scale of the disaster began to take shape. The blast had travelled through nearly 4 miles of interconnected tunnels. Pits 2, 3 and 4 were linked by common galleries, meaning the explosion had trapped men across all 3. More than 1,800 had gone below that morning. By noon, fewer than 100 had surfaced. Many burned, some mad with shock, their eyes wide and empty. Eyewitnesses described the surface as a vision of hell. Smoke vented from every opening. The slag heaps glowed red at their base, like furnaces. Pieces of timber and flesh were found as far as the railway tracks 1/2 mile away. The air smelled of sulphur, burned hair, and wet ash. Villagers from surrounding towns arrived by the hundreds. They crowded the pit heads, searching for familiar faces. Mothers called out names into the void. Priests moved through the crowds offering last rites to no one in particular. Children stood silent, clutching the hands of strangers. Company officials tried to hold back the families, citing safety, but there was no holding them. The people of Kurier knew what it meant when the sirens stopped. Silence was the worst sound of all. Down below, in the deepest galleries, the survivors fought to stay alive. They groped through darkness so absolute that direction itself became meaningless. Some tried to follow the air current, a faint draft that might lead upward. Others dug through fallen rock, following the voices of their comrades. but every movement risked collapse. Each breath drew in more carbon monoxide. A group of 13 men huddled together in one small chamber. They shared what little water they had and tried to ration the air by lying still. When one began to panic, the others held him down, whispering prayers in the dark. The heat was unbearable, but worse was the silence between distant explosions, the realization that rescue might never come. At the pit head, the rescuers faced an impossible choice: to wait until the smoke cleared, or to descend and risk being overcome by gas. Many chose the latter. They wrapped wet cloths around their faces and went down in pairs, crawling on hands and knees. Some never returned. By afternoon, teams from neighbouring mines began arriving to help. German and Belgian engineers brought canaries and primitive breathing gear. Still, the conditions were lethal. Fires burned unchecked deep underground. One rescuer described the tunnels as a tomb filled with heat and death. The company's leadership arrived from Lens around midday. They set up a makeshift command post near pit number. 3 issued orders for a full shutdown of the site. Their faces were pale, their voices tight. They spoke in the language of logistics, ventilation, shaft integrity, damage assessment, as if numbers could make sense of what had just happened. Outside, the miners' families were losing faith. The hours passed with no news. The wind shifted, blowing black smoke across the villages. It settled on rooftops, gardens, and laundry lines, a grim snow that coated everything in the residue of the dead. Inside the mine, time lost all meaning. The survivors drifted between panic and exhaustion. In one chamber, a group of 6 men and a teenage boy named Auguste Lemaire found a small trickle of water running down the wall. They took turns sipping from it, enough to keep alive the faintest thread of hope. But hope could be cruel. They heard muffled sounds, maybe footsteps, maybe collapsing rock, and shouted until their voices broke. At sunset, the flames still burned underground. The rescuers were forced back again and again. Every descent ended in failure. The mine breathed like a living creature, inhaling smoke, exhaling heat. The earth itself seemed to mourn. By nightfall, thousands of people had gathered around the pit heads. Torches burned along the fences. Women knelt in the mud, whispering names into the dark. Priests recited prayers for souls already assumed lost. No one knew it yet, but the blast had killed more than 1,000 men and boys, the youngest only 11 years old. Their bodies lay scattered through miles of tunnels, many never to be recovered. The explosion had consumed so much oxygen that even those untouched by flame had suffocated where they stood. Still, through all the smoke and grief, some refused to give up. Teams worked through the night, hammering new ventilation holes, lowering hoses, pumping air into the shafts. The fires roared back, then died again, then roared anew. The ground trembled beneath their boots, and somewhere in that vast labyrinth, a handful of men were still alive, crawling, waiting, believing that the surface would come for them. They could not know how long it would take, or how far they would have to go to find the light again. By dawn on March 11th, Courrières had become a landscape of smoke and sorrow. The fires underground still burned, feeding on coal seams that had turned the mine's heart into a furnace. The pit heads glowed faintly red in the early light, steam hissing from the ruined shafts. All through the night, the sound of hammering and shoveling had echoed, rescuers clawing at collapsed entrances, driven by equal parts duty and grief. In the nearby villages, black flags were already appearing on doorways. Women huddled in groups, faces wrapped in shawls, waiting for names that would never be read aloud. The local gendarme tried to keep order, but emotion was stronger than authority. The entire region lived in one long-held breath. At the pit head of number 3, the engineers gathered again. Their faces were streaked with soot, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep. They had managed to lower several rescue cages overnight, but each attempt met the same fate. Gas and smoke so thick it extinguished every lamp and choked every man before he reached the first level. It was clear that the mine had become a maze of fire and poison. By noon, the decision was made to seal parts of the tunnels entirely, starving the fire of oxygen. It was a grim calculus. Sealing the mine meant abandoning anyone still alive inside, but leaving it open risked new explosions that could kill the rescuers and destroy what little remained of the structure. The company officials hesitated. The crowd outside screamed at them. When the first planks went up over the shaft mouths, the people erupted. Stones flew, windows shattered in the offices nearby. One mother threw herself at the barrier screaming for her son. Another woman fainted at the edge of the fence and was carried away by strangers. A priest tried to calm the crowd, reminding them that safety had to come first, but no one wanted to hear the word safety anymore. It had lost all meaning. Underground safety was a dream. Those who had survived the initial blast were trapped in absolute night. Their lamps were gone, their lungs burning. The smell was unbearable, smoke, sulphur, and the faint sweetness of decay from those who had already succumbed. The silence between collapses was worse than the noise. It made them think. It made them count who was left. In one chamber, 8 men had found a small pocket of breathable air. They took turns lying flat, pressing their mouths against the damp earth to catch traces of oxygen. Their names were a mixture of French, Belgian and Polish, and Courrières had drawn workers from across Europe. In those hours, language no longer mattered. Only breathing did. By the third day, March 12th, the fires began to subside. The sealed shafts starved the flames, though at terrible cost. The rescuers reopened some galleries under the watch of military engineers. When they descended, they found the dead by the dozens, bodies blackened, twisted by heat. Some frozen mid-motion as if still running. Others lay in peaceful poses, hands folded, faces untouched but grey from gas. Many had died with their tools still in hand. Some were discovered in groups, as if they had tried to protect one another in the final moments. The rescuers whispered prayers as they passed them, but they could not linger. The deeper they went, the worse the air became. By March 13th, the French government had dispatched officials from Paris, along with the Minister of Public Works. Newspapers from across Europe sent reporters to Lens and Billy Montigny. Photographers arrived with heavy cameras, capturing the faces of waiting families, the weeping women, the soot-stained children, the exhausted rescue teams. Those images would later define the tragedy. Grief rendered in coal dust and silence. That day, a small miracle broke the despair. A group of survivors, 13 men in total, were found alive in one of the upper galleries near pit number 2. They had survived for nearly 60 hours by drinking condensation from the walls and sharing what little food they carried in their pockets. When the rescuers reached them, the men could barely speak. Their eyes were ringed with soot. Their voices were hoarse from days of breathing foul air. One of them, a young boy no older than 15, whispered, "There are others deeper down." The crowd erupted in hope. Bells rang from the church of Méricourt. People cheered and wept. For the first time in the 3 days, Courrières felt the flicker of life, but beneath that hope was dread. If 13 had survived, what of the rest? The answer, the rescuers soon learned, was too terrible to speak aloud. In the lower tunnels, bodies lay so thick the men had to crawl over them. Some were reduced to ashes, others were half buried under rock. Entire teams had been erased, their names later reconstructed only from shift records. Many of the boys, the lamp carriers, the runners, were never identified at all. The work of recovery went on for weeks. The miners' corpses were hauled up in carts covered with tarpaulin. A priest blessed each one before it was sent to the makeshift morgue near the pit head. Families stood in long lines, waiting to recognize what remained of their loved ones. Some could identify a man only by a belt buckle, a boot, or a fragment of clothing. The numbers grew by the day. 100 dead, then 500, then 8. By March 20th, the toll had passed 1,000. Coffins lined the streets in rows. Funerals were held every hour. The church bells of Kurier rang until their ropes frayed. Yet even as the grief consumed the living, rumours persisted, whispers that not all of the trapped were dead. Miners swore they could hear distant tapping through the rock, faint but deliberate. The engineers dismissed it as shifting stone. Still the rumour spread, fuelled by a hope that refused to die. And indeed, deep below, a small band of men still clung to life. 14 of them had fled after the explosion into an old, disused gallery near pit number 4. They were a mixed group, Frenchmen, Poles and Belgians, led by a miner named Constant Demure. They had found a half-collapsed tunnel where the air was slightly cooler and water trickled from the ceiling. For food, they chewed bark from the timber supports. For light, they had none. Days turned to nights, though they could not tell which was which. Some went mad from thirst, others prayed in silence. Each hour felt like a lifetime. At one point they decided to move, to crawl deeper into the mine in search of an exit. They tied themselves together with a rope so none would be lost in the dark. They crawled through pools of black water, over fallen beams, past the bodies of comrades. In one chamber they found the remains of a horse, long dead, its flesh preserved by the cold. They wept at the sight, not from horror, but gratitude. They ate what they could to survive. For nearly 3 weeks they wandered the tunnels, guided only by the faint current of air that whispered of the surface somewhere far away. They had no idea the mine had been sealed, or that most of France had already given them up for dead. Above, the Courrières company faced growing fury. The press accused the managers of negligence, of prioritising production over safety. Strikes erupted in neighbouring mines. The word massacre appeared in the headlines of Le Petit Parisien and Le Matin. Officials in Paris promised investigations, but for the families waiting at the pit heads, such promises felt hollow. They wanted their men back, or at least their bodies. The days stretched into weeks. By early April, the fires were finally extinguished, and large-scale recovery resumed. Most believed the story was over. The dead were being buried by the hundreds. The survivors had all been found. The mines were slowly returning to work. Then on March 30th, 20 days after the explosion, something impossible happened. At dawn, a group of rescuers working near pit number 2 heard faint noises, rhythmic tapping against metal. They froze, then shouted. The tapping grew louder. Within hours, they broke through a wall of debris and found a group of 12 men stumbling toward them. They were covered in soot, their eyes wild from darkness. They had beards like old men and voices like wind through gravel. They had survived 20 days underground without light, living on filthy water and scraps of wood. One of them, barely able to stand, murmured, "We thought we were the last men alive." When the news reached the surface, the crowd erupted in disbelief. The bells of Miraculous rang again. Women screamed and fainted. Priests fell to their knees in prayer. The 12 men were carried from the shaft on stretchers, blinking against the daylight like creatures born anew. Among them was Constant Demure, the man who had led them through the black labyrinth. Reporters surrounded him as soon as he could speak. "We followed the air," he said simply. "It led us to life." Their survival was hailed across Europe as a miracle, a testament to the will of men who refused to die. Newspapers called them les rescapés du Courrières, the Courrier survivors. Their faces appeared on posters and postcards. Children were named after them, but their joy carried the weight of unbearable guilt. For everyone who walked out alive, 100 had not. In the days that followed, more bodies were found, and miners curled around one another, still clutching hands. Others sat upright as if resting. The rescuers moved carefully, whispering as they worked. Each body was a story. Each name was a village in mourning. By April 1st, the final toll was clear. 1,099 men and boys dead. The worst mining disaster in Europe's history. The fires were out. The shaft sealed again. Courrières itself fell silent, its streets lined with crosses and black bunting. But the memory would not fade. The 12 survivors, though hailed as heroes, could not sleep without hearing the sounds of the explosion in their dreams. They avoided crowds, unable to bear the weight of being called lucky. One of them would later say, "We came back from the grave, but we left our souls behind." The people of Courrières had no words for such grief. The mine had taken fathers, sons, brothers and children, sometimes all from a single house. More than 600 widows were left behind. Over 1,000 children were orphaned. The disaster had not just destroyed a mine, it had hollowed out a community. And yet, in the days after the last funeral, as the smoke lifted and the slag heaps cooled, something else began to rise from the ashes. Anger. Because even in mourning, the people of Courrières could see the truth as plainly as the dust on their windowsills. This was not an accident born of nature. It was an explosion born of neglect. The rescue and aftermath. In the days that followed, France became a nation in mourning. Trains brought thousands to Kurier, journalists, priests, union men, even school children carrying flowers for graves that had no names. The villages of Billy-Montigny, Méricourt and Salominer were shrouded in black cloth and ash. The air smelled of smoke and candle wax. Bells tolled without pause, their echoes overlapping until they became one long, aching sound. The funerals went on for weeks. Every day, wagons carried rows of simple wooden coffins down the same narrow streets. Behind them, women walked in silence, their faces veiled. The sound of shovels became the soundtrack of spring. Some families buried 3, 4, even 5 men from the same household. In one street, no adult male was left alive. By the end of March, more than 1,000 funerals had been held. The dead were buried in long communal trenches at Méricourt. Priests read names until their voices broke. Reporters wept openly. Even soldiers sent to maintain order laid down their rifles to help lower the coffins. It was grief on a scale the nation had never seen, and with grief came anger. The Courrières company tried to control the narrative. Their official statements described the explosion as an unforeseeable natural event. The management blamed the fire damp, the treacherous gas that lurked unseen in coal seams. They said no one could have predicted such a disaster. But in every tavern and churchyard, the miners' families told another story, one of negligence, greed, and ignored warnings. A commission of inquiry was formed almost immediately. Inspectors from Paris arrived in polished boots, their notebooks clean, their questions formal. They toured the blackened pit heads, taking measurements, interviewing survivors, and noting unfortunate lapses in safety procedure. But the people of Kurier saw through the politeness. To them, this was not an inquiry. It was a performance. The miners' union, still young and struggling for recognition, seized the moment. Its leader, Émile Basley, a former miner himself, stood before the crowds and said what everyone felt. Our brothers did not die by chance. They were sent into the mine despite the fire. They were told the danger was nothing, and now their silence condemns the men who profited from it. His words spread like fire through the coalfields of northern France. By April, strikes erupted across the region, at Laon, Liévin, Valenciennes, and beyond. Tens of thousands of miners laid down their tools. They marched with banners of black and red, demanding justice for the dead of Kurier. The government called for calm. The company called for order. The miners called for change. On April 4th, a crowd of over 20,000 gathered in Lens. They marched through the streets singing the Internationale. Many carried small lamps, the same kind their fathers had carried into the mine, held aloft as symbols of both labour and loss. Police watched from the corners, uneasy. The miners had buried their fear with their dead. What remained was defiance. For the first time, the French public saw miners not as faceless labourers, but as men with names, families, and stories, victims of a system that treated them as expendable. The press turned on the Courrières company. Headlines spoke of the slaughter beneath the earth. Cartoons depicted fat industrialists lighting cigars with miners' lamps. Parliament demanded answers. In the Chamber of Deputies, one socialist representative thundered, "If this had happened in Paris, would we call it an accident? Or would we call it murder?" The words echoed far beyond the walls of government. The disaster became a mirror for an industrial nation racing toward modernity, a reminder that progress built on bodies was no progress at all. Meanwhile, the survivors struggled to return to life. The 12 men who had emerged after 20 days underground were sent to Paris as heroes. Crowds met their train at the Gare du Nord, cheering and waving flags. The government awarded them medals, the newspapers paid them for interviews, but behind their weary smiles was a darkness no medal could erase. Constant Demure, the group's leader, refused to speak of the details. "We walked through the dead," he said quietly to a reporter. "There is nothing more to say." Others drifted back to their villages, unable to sleep, unable to enter a mine again. Some were haunted by guilt for having lived when so many others had not. In Méricourt, one survivor named Charles Delattre visited the trench where his 2 sons were buried. He placed his lamp there, still blackened from smoke, and whispered, "It should have been me." He would never work again. The rescuers too carried their scars. Many had lost friends while trying to save others. Some died weeks later from the fumes they'd inhaled. One Belgian rescuer wrote to his wife, "I have seen hell, and it was under France." He never returned to the mines. The inquiry dragged on through summer. Engineers argued over technicalities, whether the explosion began with fire damp, coal dust, or a spark from a lamp. Each theory absolved someone different, but the evidence was plain. The underground fire discovered before the explosion had been treated casually, sealed instead of extinguished. That decision, made to keep production running, had allowed gas to accumulate across multiple pits. The reports stopped short of calling it negligence. The word error was used instead, a polite word that fit more easily in official documents than greed. No executive was ever charged. No compensation law existed to match the scale of loss. The widows received small payments, 200 francs, barely enough to buy food for a month. Some took in laundry, others went to work in factories. Children too young to understand why their fathers never came home began working in the mines before they turned 14. Life returned to routine, but it was a different kind of routine, one lived in shadow. By autumn, the Courrières company reopened parts of the mine. The first day back, few men showed up. The rest stood outside the gates, hats in hand, unwilling to descend again into the same earth that had swallowed their kin. "We buried our lives down there," one said. "You can't ask us to dig them up." The management hired new workers from other regions, offering small bonuses to those willing to risk it. The furnaces of France could not wait. Coal was power, and power demanded sacrifice. But not everyone accepted it. In the aftermath of the disaster, a movement began to grow, not from Paris but from the pit villages themselves. Miners began organising cooperatives, pooling money to support injured workers and widows. They built memorial societies, holding yearly processions to the graves. The tragedy had forged something no company could extinguish: solidarity. When the next wave of strikes came in 1907, they carried banners bearing a single phrase: "Souvenez-vous de Kurier," remember Kurier. That phrase became a rallying cry for a generation of labourers across Europe. It crossed borders, languages and trades. In Belgium, miners adopted it as their own. In Germany, union leaders cited it in speeches. Even in Britain, where industrialists watched nervously, the words were whispered like a warning. Courrières had changed the conversation. It exposed the fragile line between progress and exploitation, between the glow of a lamp and the flame that could kill. Still, for those who lived through it, memory was not an idea. It was a smell, a sound, a taste. The sulphur that lingered in their throats, the ringing in their ears when they heard a hammer strike steel. The mine had become part of them and part of France itself. The government eventually passed new laws. Ventilation systems were made mandatory. Dust suppression rules were enforced. Rescue brigades were formally trained and equipped with breathing apparatus. Innovations borrowed from German engineers who had rushed to Kurier to help. It was progress paid for in blood. But for every reform written into law, a grave in Méricourt marked the cost of the lesson. In late 1906, a memorial was erected near the mine. It was simple: a cross of iron, black as the coal that had caused the disaster. Beneath it were carved the words, "À nos martyrs du travail," to our martyrs of labour. On the day it was unveiled, thousands gathered. The widows stood in front, holding lamps instead of flowers. When the priest finished his blessing, no one clapped. They simply bowed their heads in silence. The mines would never again run at full capacity. Some pits were closed for good. Others operated with a ghostly quiet, the workers speaking little, each sound echoing too clearly in the dark. The company's profits fell, investors complained. The directors retired quietly, their names fading from memory. But the name Courrières would never fade. It became a word that meant more than a place. It meant a warning. Years later, when new miners descended for the first time, old men would pull them aside before the cage dropped and say, "Listen for the air, smell for the gas, and remember Courrières." That phrase, spoken softly in the darkness, carried more weight than any rulebook. For the children who grew up without fathers, the memory took different shapes. Some avoided the mines entirely, moving to cities, joining factories or the army. Others followed the same path their fathers had taken, saying it was all they knew. They worked carefully, superstitiously, touching the tunnel walls like they were alive, whispering prayers to the lost. Every March, on the anniversary of the disaster, the bells still rang in Méricourt. People gathered at the memorial with candles. The names of the dead were read aloud, though many had no markers at all. At one of those ceremonies, a survivor, old and frail now, stood at the front, his hands trembling as he lit his candle. Reporters asked if he felt grateful to have survived. He shook his head and said quietly, "We all went down together." Only some of us came back to tell it, and for a moment the crowd fell silent. They understood. Survival was not victory. It was a responsibility. To remember, to warn, to keep others from walking blind into the same fire. When the inquiry finally closed, nearly a year after the explosion, its findings filled pages of technical language. But between every line, one truth was clear. The Courrières disaster had not been a mystery of nature. It was the predictable result of risk ignored and warnings unheeded, a story as old as industry itself. The Earth had only done what man had forced it to do. It had swallowed its pain until one morning it could hold no more. A lasting legacy. The black fields of Kurier never truly recovered. Years passed, but the scars in the earth and in the people remained visible long after the smoke had cleared. The slag heaps stood like silent monuments, grey and skeletal, rising above villages rebuilt on grief. Grass grew again over the spoil tips, but nothing could soften what lay beneath them. The buried remains of men who had never come home. For France, the Courrières disaster marked the end of an age, the last illusion that industrial progress could march forward without consequence. Before 1906, the mines of northern France had symbolised national pride, the triumph of modern engineering, the proof that France could compete with Britain and Germany in the race for coal and steel. After Kurier, that pride turned to questioning. The people began to ask what progress meant if it demanded human lives by the thousand. In Paris, the newspapers that once celebrated the nation's industrial might now carried black borders and headlines of guilt. Editorials called Kurier une honte nationale, a national shame. The disaster forced even those far from the mining regions to confront the human cost buried beneath their glowing lamps and warm hearths. Every ton of coal carried the weight of the men who mined it. In the years that followed, the tragedy reshaped the relationship between labour and power. The miners' unions, which had struggled for recognition, grew rapidly in membership and influence. Courrières gave them a symbol, a rallying cry that no politician could ignore. When workers struck in the following decade, they carried banners painted with a single phrase, "Justice pour Kurier." That demand wasn't only for retribution, it was for reform, for safety, dignity and respect. The government could not remain deaf to it. In 1907, just a year after the explosion, France established the Service des Mines de Sauvetage, the National Mine Rescue Corps. It was the first of its kind in the country. Trained teams of men equipped with breathing apparatus, gas detectors, and communication systems, modelled on the German brigades that had come to Courrières in 1906. The lessons of disaster became the blueprint for protection. Mining inspectors were granted more authority. Companies were required to install improved ventilation systems and to use water sprays to control coal dust. The same dust that had turned a small fire into a chain reaction of death. Every lamp, every charge, every shaft had to be recorded and tested. For the first time, safety became law, not suggestion. Across Europe, other nations took note. Germany, Belgium and Britain revised their mining codes, studying Kurier as a case study in what could go wrong when profit outran prudence. Conferences were held, papers were written, engineers debated how to measure invisible danger, the weight of gas, the spread of dust, the strength of air currents underground. The disaster that had begun in silence now echoed through lecture halls and government chambers. Even America listened. In 1907, when an explosion tore through the Monongah mine in West Virginia, killing 362 men, journalists called it America's Courrières. The comparison was immediate and damning. The two disasters, separated by an ocean, shared the same story. Warnings ignored, gas unventilated, men buried in the name of production. Courrières had become more than an event, it had become a mirror. Yet for the people of northern France, reform brought little comfort. No law could replace the missing faces at the dinner table. The widows lived in rows of company houses, their lives now reduced to survival and memory. Some remarried out of necessity, others never did. Children grew up with the stories of fire underground, of lamps that went out all at once, of fathers who left in the morning and never came back. They learned to speak softly about the mines, as if the earth could still hear. In the years that followed, the region changed. Factories multiplied, railways spread, and electricity began to hum through the cities. But the mining towns remained in shadow. The men returned to the pits because they had no other choice. The coalfields of Pas-de-Calais still powered the nation, and work, however dangerous, meant bread on the table. Yet something in the spirit of the miners had hardened into unity. Courrières had shown them that their lives were worth more than the wages they earned. They began organising not only for pay but for rights, to be treated as citizens, not expendable labour. Across Europe, the image of the miner changed. No longer the faceless worker of the underworld, but the symbol of industrial sacrifice. Painters, poets and writers took up their story. In 1907, the novelist Émile Bazely, the same man who had led the strikes, was elected mayor of Laon and later a member of parliament. He devoted his career to the welfare of miners, introducing laws for pensions and safety. To his supporters, he was known as le député des mineurs, the miners' deputy. His power came not from political favour, but from the ashes of Kurier. Every March he returned to Méricourt to stand before the memorial, an iron cross set in a field of black stone, and bow his head with the widows. Reporters would note that he never gave speeches on those days. He simply stood there, hands clasped as the bells rang. The disaster also inspired advancements in mining technology. French engineers developed new forms of ventilation fans, better safety lamps, and systems to monitor gas levels in real time. The canary, a living alarm used in British mines, became a common sight in France too. Every small improvement carried the ghost of Courrières behind it. But not all legacies were technical. Some were human, almost spiritual. The 12 men who had survived 20 days underground became living symbols of endurance. Their names, Demour, Lemaire, Froissart, Piat, were spoken with reverence in mining towns across Europe. They toured schools and town halls, not as heroes seeking praise, but as reminders. Demour often told listeners, "We did not escape to be remembered. We escaped so others might learn his quiet humility carried more power than any politician's speech." Over time, though, these survivors faded from public life. Some returned to the mines, unable to live without the rhythm of the work. Others moved away, haunted by nightmares. A few died young, their lungs ruined by gas and smoke. By the time the First World War broke out in 1914, only a handful were still alive, and their sons were being sent to new kinds of mines, this time dug into the soil of the Western Front. The war turned the coalfields into battlefields. Artillery craters replaced slag heaps. The same earth that had once buried miners now buried soldiers. In a cruel twist of history, the lessons of Courrières about courage, comradeship and senseless loss repeated themselves on a larger scale. When peace returned, so did mining. The world rebuilt itself on the same black fuel that had caused so much grief. Yet through all the decades that followed, through 2 wars, 2 generations, and the eventual decline of coal, Kurier was never forgotten. Each year the towns gathered at the memorial. The procession was always the same. Families walking behind banners stitched with the words "Souvenez-vous de Courrières." Schoolchildren carried flowers. Old miners carried lamps. They lit them at dusk and placed them on the ground, one for every life lost, a field of flickering light where the earth had once burned with fire. The lamps glowed like stars against the black soil. Even as the mines closed in the late 20th century, the ritual continued. The descendants of miners who had long since moved away returned each March to honour the dead. The last living survivor of Courrières died in 1950, but the memory outlived him, not just in France, but in every place where men descended into darkness to earn a living. In museums and union halls, the Kurier story became a lesson taught to apprentices, not as history to memorise, but as a warning to feel. Photographs from 1906, women weeping, rescuers kneeling beside coffins, the faces of soot-covered boys, hung on the walls beside modern safety posters. The message was unspoken but clear. This is why you test for gas, why you listen when a man says the air smells wrong, why you never treat routine as safety. In the 1980s, when France began closing its last coal mines, television crews filmed the dismantling of the old Kurier pitheads. The towers came down slowly, piece by piece, but the locals refused to let the memory vanish. They kept the memorial, the graves and the museum that told the story. Schoolchildren still visit it today, learning not only about mining, but about responsibility, about what happens when warnings go unheard. The legacy of Kurier, then, is not only one of loss, it is one of reckoning. It forced a nation to confront the moral cost of progress. It gave birth to modern industrial safety. It bound a generation of workers together in solidarity, and it transformed an invisible class of labourers into the conscience of a country. Standing at the memorial now, over a century later, the landscape looks quiet. Green fields, birds, the faint hum of distant highways. But beneath the soil still lie the tunnels, sealed and silent, where the air once burned and the men of Courrières met their fate. The wind that crosses those fields carries the same whisper it always has. Souvenez-vous, remember. And in that remembrance lies the truest legacy, not in monuments or laws, but in the hearts of those who still light their lamps carefully, who still descend into the dark with respect, not pride. Because every miner who steps into the cage carries a piece of that March morning with him, the memory of how fragile life becomes when men forget to listen to the earth. And perhaps that is the greatest gift the dead of Courrières left behind, the knowledge that the progress, if it is to mean anything at all, must be built on a memory, not on ashes. The reflection. More than a century has passed since that morning in March, when the Courrières mines roared and fell silent. The towns that once trembled are calm now, the air is clear, the slag heaps are covered in grass and wildflowers. Children play where the smoke once rose, their laughter echoing over fields that no longer burn. Time has softened the edges of the tragedy, but it has never erased it. If you walk through Méricourt today, you can still feel it, not in what you see, but in what you don't. The streets are quiet, the church is modest, the rhythm of life gentle and deliberate. People here still speak of the mines the way others speak of ancestors, with respect, sorrow, and a kind of awe. In the cemetery, the memorial stands unchanged, a black iron cross against the pale northern sky. At its base, the names of the lost are carved into stone. The list seems endless. Wind whistles between the letters. Visitors leave small lamps, tokens, and bits of coal, polished smooth by hand. It is not a grand monument, but it does not need to be. Its simplicity tells the story better than words ever could. Every March they gather. Descendants, miners, teachers, and schoolchildren carrying white flowers. The bells ring again, just as they did in 1906, slow, and solemn. A priest reads a few lines from scripture. Someone plays a violin, and then there is silence. A silence that stretches across the crowd, across the fields, across the century that separates the living from the dead. It is in that silence that the true meaning of Kurier lives on, because the disaster was never only about a mine. It was about the fragility of life in the hands of progress, about the choices made in boardrooms that ripple through the homes of the poor. It was about how easily warnings can be buried beneath ambition, and how, when they are, the earth has a way of speaking louder than any man. The people of Kurier carried that truth like a wound and a lesson. Their suffering built reforms that saved thousands who would come after them. The laws that protect workers, the brigades that rescue the trapped, the air that is tested before the shift, all of it carries their fingerprints. The mine that killed them became the teacher that saved others. History rarely offers mercy, but sometimes it offers meaning. Standing at the edge of the old pit fields, it's hard to imagine what once was. The birds sing where the screams once rose. The grass hides the outlines of collapsed tunnels, but if you listen closely you can almost hear it. The echo of picks against stone, the faint hum of men at work, the heartbeat of a world built underground. And in that sound, distant but eternal, there is something almost holy. The miners of Courrières were not soldiers, not revolutionaries, not men seeking glory. They were fathers and sons, boys barely grown, men who asked for nothing more than to earn their bread. Yet in their labour they carried a nation forward, and in their deaths they reminded it of its soul. That is why their story endures, not as tragedy alone, but as testament. It tells us that progress without conscience is ruin, that warnings ignored become graves, that the price of what we build must never again be paid in silence. So the people remember. They remember in song and in stone, in the way they teach their children to respect the work that built their world. They remember when the lamps are lit at shift change, when the air smells faintly of coal, when the earth trembles just enough to remind them that it's alive. And somewhere deep beneath those northern fields the tunnels still rest, sealed, quiet, sacred, a tomb and a lesson. When the wind passes over the grass, it sounds almost like breath. When the bells toll each march, it feels like time itself pausing to bow its head. Courrières remains what it has always been, a story of men and fire, of duty and loss, of a world learning too late what it should have known all along.